joining us for this important side event on financing people-centered justice from rhetoric to resources. My name is Anushka Sinha, and I'm a young justice leader with Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the organizers and co-sponsors of this event, the Government of Sierra Leone, the Justice Action Coalition, Pathfinders, Legal Empowerment Fund, TAP Network, and the African Center of Excellence for Access to Justice and FIDA Uganda for putting together this exciting event. This session comes at an extremely pivotal moment. As the world gathers for the World Social Summit, we are reminded that justice is not an isolated goal. It is the foundation of social progress. Without access to justice, people cannot fully enjoy their rights, participate in economic life, or find protection from exclusion and inequality. In short, justice is what makes social development real and possible. Justice is not spoken about as much as it should be. Yet, access to justice and the rule of law are the cornerstone of inclusive and sustainable societies. That's why today's dialogue matters, because justice is the underlying goal that speaks to every single agenda. Our discussion today is about turning that truth into action, exploring how we can mobilize resources, partnerships, and political will to make justice a lived reality for everyone, everywhere. Today, we are joined by a distinguished group of speakers who bring diverse perspectives from government leadership to grassroots innovation and research on justice financing. Allow me to briefly introduce them. First, Mr. Shahid Korji. He's the coordinator of Sierra Leone's Justice Sector Coordination Office. He'll deliver our opening remarks and help situate and frame this discussion. Following him, we'll hear from Mr. Tom Hart, who is a senior research associate at ODI Global. Then we are also joined by Ms. Leonie Matoni, who's the coordinator of the African Center of Excellence for Access to Justice. We are also joined by Mr. Atieno Odiambo, who is the director of Legal Empowerment Fund, and by Mr. Marcus Manuel, a senior research associate at ODI Global. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Together, they will help us unpack what really works, what's fundable, and what's next, from lessons in the other sectors that they're working at to grassroots innovations, and finally to the practical financing frameworks. Our discussion today will flow in three parts. First, we'll have short opening interventions from each speaker, a moderated dialogue to connect these insights, and finally an open Q&A for reflections from the audience. So, with that, let's begin. It's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Mr. Shahid Korji. The floor is all yours.
Hi, hello. Can you all hear me? Yes. So good afternoon from Freetown, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Shahid Mustafa Koji, coordinator for the Justice Sector Coordination Office, and thank you so much for inviting me to make a statement this morning. It is an honor to join you today on the sidelines of the World Social Summit, a gathering that calls on all of us to renew our shared commitments and to dignity, equality, and opportunity for every person. As we meet here to reflect on how we can build more inclusive and resilient societies, I am reminded that justice is not a separate goal. It is the trend that weaves all together, all of us together. Justice is a public good, as essential to human well-being and social stability as healthcare, education, and decent work. Without justice, inequality festers. Without justice, people cannot access the opportunities that development promises. Access to justice is, in essence, access to fairness, the ability of every person to have their voice heard, their rights protected, and their grievances resolved. It is what makes our society, our social contract real. And so, when we talk about eradicating poverty, promoting full employment and ensuring social inclusion. The very pillar, because justice is the means through which people can claim their rights, secure their livelihoods, and participate fully in society. Now, in Sierra Leone, we believe that justice and social development are inseparable. Our own national justice experience shows that when people have access to fair and responsive justice systems, whether to secure land rights, resolve labor disputes, or protect women and children from violence, the results are not only more peaceful communities, but also more equitable growth. Justice builds confidence, strengthens governance, and opens the door to opportunity. That is why in Sierra Leone, we are proud to be member of the Justice Action Coalition, a partnership of governments, civil society organizations, and international institutions united in the conviction that justice must be for people, by people, and with people. Through this coalition, we are working to ensure that justice is not seen as a luxury or an afterthought, but as a core enabler of sustainable and inclusive development. I am particularly pleased to announce that yesterday, the Justice Action Coalition released a joint statement during the 2025 World Summit for Social Development. This statement emphasizes that ensuring equal access to justice is critical for the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights. It calls for a stronger financial commitment to people-centered justice to advance social and economic rights, including through the Justice Financing Framework. The Justice Financing Framework provides a practical pathway for countries to better plan, budget, and invest in people-centered justice. This framework reflects what we know to be true, that achieving justice for all is not just a matter of political will, but of smart financing and deliberate action. Today's discussion is timely and urgent. Around the world, communities are calling not only for promises of justice, but for delivery, for resources that make justice accessible, affordable, and effective at the front lines where people live and work. The work ahead of us is to move from rhetoric to resources, from commitment to capacity, and from aspiration to action. So, as we begin this important conversation, let us remember that justice is the foundation on which inclusion, equality, and opportunity stand. Let us ensure that when the world speaks of social progress, it speaks also of justice, because there can be no lasting social development without it. Thank you so very much for listening. I yield back the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Korji, for setting the scene and grounding us in why justice, and especially people-centered justice, one that is built by and for the people, must be viewed as a public good and a pillar for social development. Our next speaker today is Mr. Tom Hart, Senior Research Associate at ODI Global. Tom has been exploring how lessons from the health sector, particularly the success in scaling up primary healthcare, can guide justice systems in achieving similar results. Tom, you recently co-authored a paper on health and justice, exploring how justice can be delivered more effectively and drawing on lessons from the health sector's success in scaling up services. My questions for you are: what were the key turning points that helped the health sector attract sustained investment in primary care? And what lessons could the justice sector borrow to make the case for financing people-centered justice at scale? The floor is yours, Tom.
Thank you, Anushka, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak. As you mentioned, I'm going to draw off a recent report that we published at ODI with support from Pathfinders and the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, called More Money for Justice and More Justice for the Money. I'm going to cover two themes in my remarks. Firstly, lessons on financing from the health sector, which is to emphasise the importance of government spending. There's no way to bypass the need to raise sufficient tax revenues to fund essential services. And second, 3 lessons on spending smarter, on the role of international evidence, on the importance of primary healthcare for cost-effective spending, and the importance of a shared set of high-level measurable goals. To turn first to the lessons on financing, user fees and insurance are often suggested as alternatives to budgetary funding for basic services in both the health and justice sector. But experience from the health sector suggests that these are both false paths for most countries. User fees were introduced as a response to fiscal constraints in the 1980s by most African countries, but they were then removed in the 2000s as evidence mounted of their negative impact on access to services, reducing demand for health services by up to 50%, particularly among the poorer segments of the population. This negative impact, together with the fact that they raised less revenue than expected and did not lead to the degree of community participation in health facilities that was originally envisaged, led to their withdrawal. So there's now a near consensus in the health sector that universal health services must rely on compulsory sources of prepaid financing, meaning either taxation or compulsory insurance. But now looking at insurance, health insurance has not proved feasible in many lower income countries with a large informal sector where you cannot levy payroll taxes. Where it has worked in countries such as Ghana and Rwanda, it is because it relies in large part on general budgetary financing, not insurance premiums. And even in high-income countries such as Japan and Hungary, with nominally social health insurance systems, these are increasingly funded from general taxation rather than just earmarked payroll taxes. So this is not just a change that we are seeing in just lower-income countries. I think the message of the Director General of the World Health Organization at the Africa Health Sovereignty Summit in Accra this August applies equally to justice. He said, "The responsibility for financing strong, resilient health system rests with governments. The most efficient and equitable source of health financing is the national budget. More money alone is not enough. What's important is how effectively that money is used." So now to move on to lessons on spending smarter. So how can we spend more efficiently? How can countries and governments deliver more justice services at a lower cost? Some lessons from the health sector. First, while international evidence is important, it must be coupled with stronger domestic policy processes. In the health sector, there has been significant international efforts to identify the most cost-effective spending options for health in low and middle-income countries, prioritizing primary healthcare for at least 30 years. This mainly stems from the landmark 1993 World Development Report, Investing in Health, and a set of work that has consistently followed up on that initial report and its analysis. But that work has equally demonstrated that if international evidence is to be influential on domestic spending, then national capacities are needed to use and evaluate economic evidence and to institutionalize this into policymaking and budgetary processes. One prominent example of this is the role of Thailand's quasi-independent or quasi-autonomous Health Intervention and Technology Assessment Program, which informs its universal health coverage scheme. So if the first lesson is on evidence, the second is that cost-effective spending options have often involved task shifting with an enhanced role for lower cadres of health workers and for community health workers. For example, Ethiopia has driven positive improvements in its health outcomes through recruiting 30,000 community health extension workers and building 15,000 village health posts. In another context, to refocus its inherited Soviet-era health system, which had been dominated by hospitals, and to refocus it on public health, Kyrgyzstan closed 42% of its hospitals in the early 2000s and upgraded its community health centers. There is a clear analogy to the justice sector here, driving greater impact of public spending by enhancing the role of frontline service providers, such as community-level legal advice and assistance and informal dispute resolutions, rather than just relying on the higher level of lawyers and formal courts. The third lesson is that both international and domestic action has been partly driven by a focus on a shared set of high-level goals. Clear time-bound targets on key health outcomes, notably maternal and child health, and focus on disease outcomes, notably on HIV, TB, and malaria, has focused attention, led to the creation of of new financing institutions, and new global and domestic monitoring processes. A whole sectoral ecosystem of monitoring results and looking for improvements has only been made possible by the setting of clear, commonly agreed and measurable outcome targets. These could then drive improved performance at national and subnational levels. An example of this is Zambia's realization that it was lagging on MDG 5 on maternal mortality, and this was an important factor in driving improved performance at the national and district levels. So building a consensus on clear definitions and frameworks for measuring justice outcomes would be one good starting point for the justice sector, as seen, for example, in the OECD's current efforts to develop a monitoring framework. So to conclude by summarizing these lessons, basic services need public funding, appropriately domesticated international evidence, a focus on the most cost-effective services, and a shared set of high-level measurable goals to drive progress. Anushka, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for that insightful parallel. It's so encouraging to see how approaches from the health sector can really guide us towards a more systematic and sustainable financing for justice. So thank you for sharing those insights. Next, we turn to the grassroots. I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Leonie Matoni, coordinator of the African Center of Excellence for Access to Justice. Leonie, given the center's work in promoting access to justice, universal human rights, and legal aid for the marginalized communities, I'd like to ask you two questions. First, how do grassroots legal services bridge the gap between communities and formal systems? Something that I'm particularly excited to hear from you about. And secondly, what evidence exists of their impact and cost effectiveness in delivering people-centered justice? Over to you, Leonie.
Thank you very much, Anushka. Just to confirm, am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Good evening from Kigali, and good morning or afternoon, wherever you are joining from in the world. It's an absolute pleasure to join this discussion on financing people-centered justice, a topic that I think could not be more timely or more urgent. So the African Center of Excellence for Access to Justice is a continent-wide network of civil society organizations that are working to advance access to justice and human rights. We currently have 18 member organizations across 15 African countries, and all of our members provide legal aid services at grassroots level. So together, our mission is quite simple, promoting access to justice for vulnerable communities. And we have come to understand, of course, that vulnerabilities can manifest differently, which is why it is essential to place people at the center of systems. Some people can be vulnerable because, say, they are children or LGBT victims or asylum seekers, refugees, detainees, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ, or even financially disadvantaged, etc. So when we talk about people-centered justice, we mean justice systems that respond to people's real needs and taking into account all their intersecting realities. So in other words, justice that meets people where they are, linguistically, socially, geographically, etc. And just to give a very practical example, think of, say, a single mother in a remote area who has lost her piece of land because a local official maybe unfairly allocated it. So she doesn't have time often, she doesn't have enough time, money, or sometimes even confidence to hire a lawyer and navigate court procedures. But a community paralegal who is trained in basic law and mediation can help her resolve this issue within days or weeks at no cost. And this will restore for her her land, her livelihood, her dignity, without her even having to step into a courtroom. So community justice actors like paralegals, village mediators, and other grassroots justice actors basically act as translators between formal systems and people. So they help communities to better understand their rights, to resolve their disputes early, and also build trust where institutions or formal systems can be distant and or even intimidating. So essentially, they bridge the gap in formal systems by bringing justice closer to people. I think another perfect example would be the mobile legal aid clinic approach, which takes legal services directly to villages, refugee camps, prisons, you name it. And these clinics, they offer legal advice, mediation, even representation, and they ensure that justice is not confined to offices or courtrooms, but rather it's present where people live and work. So through these clinics, legal aid providers at grassroots levels are able to take services to the people rather than demanding people to seek them out. I also cannot forget to mention the incredible work that community justice actors do of resolving conflicts at community level, which this not only addresses pressing challenges like case backlogs and prison overcrowding, but it can also mend relationships in communities through mediation work. You can imagine it's much harder to mend a relationship with someone once you have taken them to court. And because paralegals come from the communities that they serve, they are trusted and approachable by marginalized groups that might maybe hesitate to approach formal authorities. So all this to say that in practice, grassroots legal service providers do what formal systems often cannot, which is to meet people where they are. And on the question of what evidence exists of their impact and cost effectiveness, we don't need to guess whether community justice works. There is now solid evidence from both field data and comparative studies showing that justice models, community justice models rather, deliver quick, low cost, and lasting solutions. I'm very happy to see Marcus on this call because he conducted a research which our center participated in, and it was on frontline justice services in lower income countries. And the findings were striking. For example, they found that community-based paralegal models deliver justice at a fraction of the cost of formal systems, and they also resolve disputes more quickly with higher satisfaction rates. And maybe to put that into perspective, a lawyer can easily charge hundreds of dollars just for consultation on a case that can take months or even years in court. A community-based paralegal, by contrast, offers free support and often settles disputes in days or weeks. And in Rwanda, where I am based, for example, paralegals support the Legal Aid Forum by resolving, I think, over 60 to 70% of all the cases that we receive through mediation. And another report I want to mention that was on diverse pathways to justice, which was prepared by the Working Group on Customary and Informal Justice in SDG 16, emphasized that actually most people in Africa do not rely on formal court systems for justice problems. Instead, they often turn to customary and informal justice mechanisms. And there's many more studies on this, but beyond research evidence, I think a clear sign that these approaches work is that some governments have actually institutionalized them. So Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Malawi, for instance, they have formally recognized community-based paralegals and integrated them into their legal aid systems. So, and I think we can agree that that kind of recognition doesn't happen by chance. It reflects demonstrated impact and, of course, value for money. But yet, despite carrying the brunt of this essential work, people-centered justice initiatives remain chronically underfunded. And we have seen in recent years, especially this year, I feel like aid cuts to justice work have had astronomical impact, where we've seen many legal aid clinics have closed, paralegals continue to volunteer without incentives, and small grassroots organizations, which are closest to people, are now having to carry out this life-changing work on shoestring budget. And so this is why conversations like today are crucial. And I agree with what Shahid said. We've seen it also at our center that justice isn't a luxury, it is a lifeline. So we need financing models that can both recognize people-centered justice as integral part of national systems, but also funding that enables replication and scaling of these proven models. Thank you very much. Back to you, Anushka.
Thank you so much, Leonie. Your examples truly highlight how community-based innovations are bridging justice and bringing them closer to those who need it the most. And as you said, justice is not just a framework, it is a lifeline for so many people. And in doing so in so many ways that are efficient and people-led. So thank you for sharing such incredible examples with us today. Our next speaker for today is Ms. Atieno Odiembo, Director of the Legal Empowerment Fund. Atieno, the LEF has been at the forefront of channeling resources directly to grassroots justice defenders. Based on that, I'd like to ask you two questions. What convinced the Legal Empowerment Fund that people-centered justice is an investment worth making, not just a moral cause? And when you look at justice from a social development perspective alongside health, education, or climate, what makes justice a smart and catalytic investment? The floor is all yours, Atieno.
Thank you very much, Anushka. And it's a good thing I come right after Leonie Mutoni because she and her comments are also overlapping with what I'm going to be speaking about. To your question about what convinced the LEF that people-centered justice is an investment worth making and not just a moral cause, I'm not sure that the LEF needed any convincing at all that people-centered justice is an investment worth making. We've always funded from the ground up, resourcing grassroots and community groups. So when we talk about justice, people often think judges, courtrooms, but for most communities, as Leonie has mentioned, justice starts much closer to home, with a neighbor who helps draft a complaint, a paralegal who walks a person through bail and bond, or when a widow secures a title deed, and when community negotiates fair terms for use of their land. These are grassroots justice defenders, and they are not the last mile, they are the first mile. And if we want justice systems to actually work, we have to fund and invest where justice actually lives, and it has to be people-centered. So from the outset, the LEF was set up as a movement-building initiative to resource grassroots groups and communities using legal empowerment strategies to access justice and defend their rights. Our grantee partners are paralegals, organizers, youth leaders, women's collectives, disability rights activists, barefoot lawyers, just about anybody who is working on access to justice. And their goal is to help ordinary people know, use, and shape the law. And they resolve problems early and at a lower cost with a deeper legitimacy because of their partnership with communities. The founding organizations that established the Legal Empowerment Fund in 2021 actually took a leaf from the health sector, which had demonstrated how to do more with limited funds and doctors by focusing on outcomes and frontline delivery. And people-centered justice can do the same. That is, it targets the most common problems, fund community advocates closest to the problems, and then scale what works. So is this really investment-like? I think so. I think absolutely it is investment-like, because what investment in justice really provides is measurable outcomes, cost efficiency, and most importantly, lasting legitimacy of the rule of law, something which is falling apart today in today's world, each passing day. So our grants portfolio at the Legal Empowerment Fund tells the story of why people-centered justice is an investment worth continuing to make. First, as also, that Leonie had mentioned is, the quick and efficient outcomes. You get to see outcomes much more quickly. The LEF is relatively new, and what we've seen from our 4 years of grant making is a consistent pattern of paralegals, community law organizers, barefoot lawyers, solving everyday problems at the communities at a very low cost and at an effective level. They mediate disputes before they explode. They help secure documents needed for jobs and benefits, and also help community members navigate procedures that have stalled. Additionally, they have proximity and knowledge of the problems. Grassroots actors know the problems, and because of their lived experience, they're the ones who are best placed to resolve problems at a deeper and more systemic level. They do more than just fix individual cases, rather they're able to surface patterns and through advocacy find remedies for them. Their proximity also enables them to provide real-time data and feedback for system reform. Another aspect is the trust and legitimacy in the process. Through legal empowerment, communities and individuals get to know, use, and shape the law. And you find that people tend to comply with rules and regulations that they have helped shape and processes that they understand. But perhaps most importantly is that justice becomes preventive. The resources spent on preventing justice issues such as unlawful detention, court time, health costs are fewer and cheaper than responding to a crisis. So in conclusion, if any person who cares about the SDGs has to care about the last mile, where people meet rules, paperwork, and power. And these are roadblocks, which at this particular last mile are really stumbling blocks for people accessing justice. And people-centered justice is the least expensive place to reduce failure in those encounters, which is why we at the Legal Empowerment Fund continue to bet on it with flexible and multi-year grants to grassroots groups globally. And then to your second question about what makes justice a smart and catalytic investment. So I had to really ponder this question because I kept thinking I have to speak in terms of corporate investment, but I think I found a way to articulate it without going down that rabbit hole. So justice is catalytic because it removes the legal and administrative backlogs that keep other investments from paying off. Like healthcare, frontline justice is preventive, inexpensive, and scalable. And when everyday people can resolve their problems quickly and fairly, other development agendas such as education, climate, gender equality, affordable and clean energy work out much better. Justice is smart and catalytic because as I mentioned before, it prevents crises before they form and before they erupt. Most justice failures and problems originate outside of courtrooms. For example, land and labor disputes and lack of or missing identification papers. If these issues are resolved, if these issues go unresolved, they can ultimately spiral into poverty, displacement, and even violence. For example, in Sierra Leone, our grantee partners are using legal empowerment strategies to help communities secure their land. And they're not just avoiding land disputes, they're also protecting food security and stabilizing household income. Another reason why justice is smart and catalytic is because it's an enabling infrastructure that enables other services. And when I keep talking about other services, I'm talking about all the other, the other SDGs. So in other words, justice unlocks access across the entire development spectrum. It's also a gateway to services. And this is particularly true. I think one of the common recurring issues we keep seeing within at the Legal Empowerment Fund and even with our other partners is the lack of identity documents. A child cannot be enrolled in school if they don't have a birth certificate. One cannot receive a mobile cash transfer without an ID. And it's also impossible to defend tenure over land without title. Legal empowerment grantee partners who help communities secure ID cards are not just doing legal work, but they're actually enabling access to social protection, health services, and financial inclusion. So, it isn't that glamorous, but it really has, a multiplier effect and impact. And justice is also smart and catalytic because it can be measured and managed. And we know that measurement and accountability make it investable. So I'm not even sure if investable is a word, but I'm going to keep using it. So for many years, justice was treated as too intangible or difficult to measure. But across our grantee partners at the Legal Empowerment Fund, we are seeing simple but powerful indicators, such as, the usual ones which we constantly talk about: disputes resolved, rights claimed, resolution times, and land secured. One of our partners, for example, in Kenya, who works with informal workers, is tracking both dispute resolution times as well as the economic benefits that flow therefrom. So, for example, wage theft cases, Those numbers are just not abstract. They represent tangible things like school fees paid and rent paid. So at the Legal Empowerment Fund, we see that justice is not just about overhead. It's the operating system for development, the common thread enabling all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. When communities can secure land titles, when street vendors know their rights, when youth can resolve conflicts peacefully, everything else starts to work better. For their livelihoods, for safety, for education, for climate adaptation, you name it. So to me, justice is that quiet system that makes all other systems deliver. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Etienne. These reflections beautifully show how justice is both a rights issue and an investment case capable of generating broad social returns. Thank you so much for your reflections. And now on to our final panelist for today, Mr. Marcus Manuel, who is a senior research associate at ODI Global, who has been leading the development of the Justice Financing Framework with the Justice Action Coalition. Marcus, your work offers a roadmap for translating political commitment into practical financing strategies. So my two questions for you are, first, how does the Justice Financing Framework help translate political will into concrete, results-oriented financing strategies for justice? And second, what practical steps or tools does it offer to governments or even partners looking to integrate justice into national budgets or social investment plans? Over to you, Marcus.
Anushka, thank you very much. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay,
perfect.
thank you. Okay, and thank you very much for putting the slides up. I suggest we just jump to slide 3, as Anushka's already kindly articulated the questions, and let me dive straight into the Justice Financing Framework. But can I say what a privilege it is to be on such a panel with people who are working on the front line and enabling people to work on the front line to make a difference. So what is the Justice Financing Framework and who's been involved? So this really stems from a very simple observation. What gets budgeted gets done. If we don't budget for things, we're never going to see things happen. And similarly, if we don't budget for things in national budgets, we'll never get to scale. As the founder of BRAC famously said, small is beautiful, but scale is necessary. So we need deliberate budgets for people-centered justice. We need a new level of ambition to do that. And the Justice Financing Framework is a financing guide to close the justice gap. Sahid's already mentioned this. There's a work underway, and the framework is due to be published later this month. Anushka, you very kindly suggested I've been leading on this. May I quickly say this has been an enormous team effort. So ODI Global has been leading and working on the technical input, along with great colleagues from the Hague Institute for the Innovation of Law. And this has all been done under the wrap of Pathfinders who've held us all together and have brought this together. But it also reflects inputs from the World Bank, UNDP, OECD, IDLO, and WJP, just to mention 5 acronyms, but there's many more, and Namati as well. So lots of people have inputted into this process. So the financing framework has got two elements to it. So can I have the next slide, please? So the first one is 7 policy recommendations. And I just want to pick out a few of those just to illustrate what we're talking about today. The first one, develop outcome objectives focused on resolving people's most pressing justice problems. You would think this is a very self-evident statement, but when you look at how justice budgets are set, they're often very different. So it's quite typical in a justice budget for the leading issue to be the backlog of cases in the formal courts. What we're saying is instead, which may be tens of thousands of cases in a country, this is a serious problem for the courts. But what it ignores is the justice gap of the millions of people in the same country who can't even access justice. So what we're saying is we just need to change what we start by looking at. And that means looking at what are people's most pressing justice problems. The second thing we need to do is say, okay, we've identified where the problems are. The question is, what are the functions we need to do to deliver this? Now, again, justice budgeting typically starts with what do the law courts need? What do the police need? many of the functions needed to resolve people's most pressing justice problems are not to be found there. They're often to be found in other budgets, or often not even in budgets at all. And they're just being funded through the goodwill of philanthropists or just pro bono lawyers doing work. So again, we need to change from an institutional focus to a function-based focus of what we're trying to do. And then in section 6, I say fundamental cost effectiveness. There are too many examples of interventions that we do that aren't cost effective. And these matter a lot when money is short. We need to be using the most cost-effective approaches to engage on that. Can I go to, we need to spend more smartly, as Sahid pointed out earlier, and as Tom, my co-author, and again, the health paper that he wrote very much informs the approach that we're taking here. So could I have the next slide, please? So we also propose in the financing framework 4 financing ambitions. And I'm just going to pick on one today for the interest of time. And that's this one. Within primary frontline justice services, prioritize information, advice, assistance, and informal dispute resolution. And just to be clear, what we're talking about there includes things like the customary and informal justice systems that many countries have. So this block of activities currently is almost completely unfunded. And what we're suggesting is that there should be a minimum of 2.5% of the total justice spending across the courts, the prisons, the police, and everyone should be allocated to these services. It doesn't sound very much, but it would be a major difference as to what is currently happening at the moment. Now, if I get on to the next slide, one of the issues is we don't just want to fund frontline services, we want to fund cost-effective frontline justice services. And there have been examples you can have very high-cost services operating. Fortunately, the research that I've been working on, and Leonie was kind enough to mention, and she's one of the people who stars in our research, we're getting many examples of cost-effective frontline services. So we do know how to do it. It's not that we don't know how to do it, we do know how to do it. We've got proven track record. There is, however, one exception. We've got every continent apart from, well, the clues in the picture. We have yet to tackle Antarctica. If anyone can help us cracking that one, please let us know. The next slide, please. So in cost-effective frontline services, as others have mentioned, paralegals tend to be a key element of it. And what we found is there are robust academic studies that point to frontline justice services as the strongest evidenced and the best value money intervention in the whole of the justice sector. So why is it that the best evidence, best value of money investments are the ones we're investing least in? This is where we feel there's a real scope for the justice financing framework to encourage smarter spending. It will involve regulatory reform. That's going to be part of the picture. And these paralegals get called lots of different things. Community justice workers, frontline justice workers is a new phrase that's emerging in the US, for example. And they do a range of things. They can provide information, they can provide advice. They often end up providing alternative dispute resolution, helping with informal mediation. And often they're involved in strengthening customary and informal justice systems so they work in a fairer and better and more transparent way. But the regulations need to adapt to allow that to happen. And many countries, some countries it has and others it hasn't. Sierra Leone is one of the most famous of having really pressed into this space to deal with the regulatory issues. Could I have the next slide, please? And then what I said is finally, there's a small but vital shift is needed in spending. We don't know at the moment really how much countries spend on frontline primary justice services. This is a new term that no one's really used before. So the best proxy we've got, which isn't brilliant, but it's the best one we have, is the amount of legal aid that's spent if you exclude criminal legal aid. So we've done analysis across the world of how much countries spend on it. Many countries don't even have this data, but those that do, it's clear that few are spending anywhere near the 2.5% we suggest is what's needed. Our suggestion is based on what the cost would be for having a nationwide service that could provide the level of services that would be commensurate with the justice needs that we see in many countries. So our target is based on how you would get to that. The other thing to point out is 2.5% is small. If you spread it over 5 years, you're talking about a very small shift each year, just 0.5% of the budget each year. Now, most justice budgets grow at least as fast as the general economy, so they're probably going 2 or 3% a year. So what we're saying is take some of that 2 to 3% growth a year and give the first 0.5% to building up your frontline justice services. It would make an enormous difference over the long run. And as I say, in many countries, this would mean a 5-fold or even a 10-fold increase to the current levels of funding that are provided to those services. So on my final slide, please, thank you. So how do we pivot from rhetoric to reality, to use the great phrase that was introduced at the beginning of this meeting? So 2 suggestions. We think big. There's a real need to reimagine what we do about justice budgeting. Right from the beginning, how we even begin to start to think about it, right through to the way how we plan and implement that. So there's some very big ideas in the justice financing framework. There are also some small ideas. And one of them is a very one, just start to take primary frontline justice services seriously and invest small sums of money, but large sums of money compared to what's currently being spent in these services. And if we do that, we can start to see real change happening. So that's why we're so excited about this justice financing framework. We do hope it's going to be taken up. We hope countries will find it interesting, will start experimenting with it. And we hope that this combination of thinking big, but starting with small steps, will provide a way through. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for that incredible presentation and great detail also, I may add. That framework really gives us exactly what this discussion calls for, a structured way to move forward from rhetoric to resources. So thank you again for that. We now open the floor to our audience for reflection, questions, or insights, because no discussion can be made possible without the efforts of the audience, who are all chiming in from different parts of the world. Please use the chat function and we'll bring your questions in. As you share, I invite you to think about our 3 framing questions: what's working, what's fundable, and what's next. Let's hear your thoughts on how we can make people-centered justice a funded and measurable part of social progress. Let's wait a minute or 2 and I'll get the questions in and I'll pose them on to our incredible speakers here today. So please take some time and feel free to write it in the chat.
Anushka, if I can come in and read some of the questions that we see in the chat. There's a question from Mercedes. Good morning. Good afternoon, all. Thank you to all the speakers. I would like to ask, what makes community justice models so effective in reaching those most often left behind? And I see another one from Catherine, and this is specifically for Tom. How do we make the case that investing in justice delivers measurable social returns, much like investing in health or education? So those are 2 questions that have already been posed. Oh, and I see there's a third one, sorry. This decision-making must come from communities now. Do you think that create community institutions to meet and take actions is crucial for justice promotion? I guess creating community institutions. So I think that's an open question as well.
Thank you so much, Temba, for sharing those questions. I would like to put someone on the spotlight for just 1 second for the first question. Leonie, I'd really like to hear your insights on the first question, just because we have a focus on the community. And then any one of the speakers can take it up, and then we move to Tom, to whom a specific question has been directed. Leonie, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Anushka, and thank you for Mercedes for your question. So in our experience at the African Center of Excellence for Access to Justice, community justice models are effective because they start where people are. When we speak of community-based paralegals or village mediators, they live among the people they serve. So they speak the same language, they understand the local realities, and they are often trusted within these communities. So that proximity itself allows them to resolve issues quickly and affordably and in ways that mend relationships rather than deepen divisions. I mentioned the mobile legal aid clinic approach as an example. So in rural Rwanda, as I am sure is common in many countries on the continent and to some extent globally, many women cannot travel long distances to seek legal services because of the sheer amount of responsibilities that they have in their homes. But when a mobile legal aid clinic visits their neighborhood, they can step out, even if just briefly, to learn about their rights or speak with a lawyer. And without this kind of outreach, many of their justice needs would have remained unheard or unresolved. You wouldn't believe the number of people or women we have come across who didn't know that GBV was actually a crime. They thought maybe it's a patriarchal norm, but from attending these sessions, they were able to learn about their rights. And I think this can also apply to prisons or refugee camps. These clinics reach people who are otherwise completely cut off from formal justice systems. So to sum up, these community justice models work because they make justice accessible, but also human and real, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Leonie. Anyone else who'd like to add in?
There is it's a question that Temba hasn't posed, but there's a question about how do migration patterns affect community, and Leonie had just started to mention that. But I think, in many ways, it affects them because, trust has to, constantly be rebuilt with every place that they are moving to. There are power dynamics that shift as you move from one community or one space to the other. And then, there's also the issue around, legal identity as migration takes place. But I feel, my opinion is that with informal justice systems, with the community justice systems, these marginalized populations are still able to access justice and in a much quicker way because they're not really relying on the formal justice systems.
Thank you so much, Etienne, for answering that question. I'd now like to move to Tom. We have a specific question for you, and that is, how do we make the case that investing in justice delivers measurable social returns, much like investing in health or education?
Thanks, Anushka, and thanks, Catherine, for your question. I think the kind of short answer is, well, that the justice sector needs to work with economists to quantify this and to think through the mechanisms by which access to justice and justice services can have these measurable benefits. And I mean, just to think of some examples that have been talked about earlier, we were talking about people's ability to have security in their land rights and their land entitlements. There's lots of economists who study the impact that kind of land tenure security has on productivity and has on investments in that. So that is one avenue by which kind of greater access to justice, greater legal rights would lead to kind of demonstrable economic gains. It might also allow investments in small business and so on. And there's also the kind of the non-economic but social costs. So we were just Leonie in her answer was just talking about the kind of knowledge of legal rights to reduce gender-based violence. Like, if you can do that, that's obviously having massive impacts on the social welfare of the women who are impacted by that. And that's a kind of another thing that we can, in the same way that we can measure health gains or think about measuring health gains, we can measure the welfare gains on those and think about trying to quantify those and look at the returns. I would just caution to say that, I think this is really important to do this, but it's not the kind of end all. And if you speak to people in the health sector, especially who are trying to kind of use the kind of demonstration of the kind of economic benefits of investment in healthcare to persuade ministries of finance to access more money, they will often complain that this is something they don't think ministries of finance appreciate much. So I think even with the evidence there, that's just a starting point for thinking about how that is used and how it can influence resource allocation in government. But I think Marcus also wants to come in on this, so I'll hand over to him now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. My next person in line was Marcus, so thank you so much for raising your hand. We'd love to hear your insights, and thank you, Tom, for that.
Thank you. And it's just such a great question. And I would underline everything that Tom has just said. There is value here. We need to be cautious about it. I would say two other things. Firstly, it is much harder in the justice sector. In health, you can work out, this intervention will save someone's life. And you can put a value on someone's life, and then you can do cost-benefit analysis on that and make the point. It's hard to say someone's solved a justice case. What's the benefit to them? Now, there is some new thinking coming in countries looking at measuring people's well-being. So moving beyond a sort of simple economic measure or something to a well-being measure. And ministers of finance in some countries are starting to grapple with these issues. So that might be a way forward, but that's pretty cutting edge and new stuff. Where I think it's very useful is helping us distinguish between what really is the most useful and within the justice sector, saying we ought to be doing at least these things where there is such high returns. So there is very robust evidence. So, for example, Citizens Advice in the UK gets a rate of return of something over 30 to 1, which is, for any investment project, is an amazing rate of return to offer. And lots of community justice work gets ratios where it's measured, gets again maybe 15 or 20 to 1. And the village courts, for example, in Bangladesh, which have been well studied, also give a ratio. And basically anything from a public finance viewpoint where the ratio, the benefit ratio to the cost ratio is in excess of 15 to 1 gets described as a phenomenal investment. I mean, there are not many of these around the world, full stop. So once you're in that sort of level, it is a way of helping spark people's interest and engagement. The other thing to do, and I think this is the piece of research that I've always wanted to see done that hasn't happened yet, that comes from Sierra Leone, where the Legal Aid Board has come up with a very smart, cost-effective way of securing maintenance from absent parents, mainly fathers in Sierra Leone. And they've got a very smart way of how they ensure that the money is paid, and when it's not paid, of how to make sure it does get paid without having to start a whole new court case again. So it's just some very clever thinking has gone into it. And we reckon the benefit they're getting from that is something like 50 to 1. So the change in that individual, and often it's girls, life circumstances of getting that maintenance benefit compared to the cost of doing it, the benefit cost ratio is something like 50 to 1, which is just extraordinary. So I mean, if that number really is right, and we could get that properly identified, this could be an amazing example of just how transformative things can be. So I think, accept it's quite difficult in general, but let's also do where we can to make the points more as illustrative rather than comprehensively convincing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for adding in your insights. We do have a few more questions coming in, and there's two that tie into migration. And I know, Atieno, you briefly answered one of them. I'd like to pose them again to all of our speakers to answer. First being, how does justice work in a community when migration is so common? And how does migration, in fact, affect community justice? I would love if any one of you could take it up. The floor is all yours, speakers. Go ahead, Marcus. You're on mute.
That would help. Thank you very much. I think it really underlines the case of identifying what people's legal needs are. So if in a country we can work out there is a group of people who've got extreme legal needs when it comes to immigration issues. I mean, these are so constraining to their whole livelihoods, their livelihood, indeed they're staying in the country. These are really, really extreme, high value or high cost legal needs. We would then more sensibly say, well, okay, where should we be putting our money in terms of helping solving? Well, we should deal with the most impactful resources. And then we need to work out, well, how do we do it in the most cost efficient way? And it probably is training paralegals to be community paralegals in that particular community as a way of helping and engaging. So I think it's having systems that are smart enough and quick enough to respond to say, okay, we've got a really emerging problem here. And as part of overall justice in the country, this is something we need to be taking seriously. And it's important for the migrants, it's important for the communities the migrants live in, if these issues aren't addressed, because often if they're not addressed through legal means, they end up being forced into illegal means of livelihoods. So this doesn't really help anyone at all. But that's my minor contribution to the debate. There are others who are much more involved in the front line of doing this in practice.
Thank you so much, Marcus. We have more questions pouring in for you, but before I jump back to you, I would like to take up another question from Lynette, and it's posed to Atieno. Atieno, if I can have your attention, how can we better measure the impact of justice investments to attract and retain funders? The floor is all yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that question. And that's the million-dollar question. I wish I had the answer to it immediately, because then the Legal Empowerment Fund would be able to meet a lot of justice needs. To me, when I look at measuring impact, and it's really about looking at how do we, when we think of impact and scale, which is what a lot of funders want to measure, which is what a lot of funders want to see, there is the question around whose impact, whose scale, and can we start to look at it differently, especially within communities who actually know and have the depth of knowledge of what impact they are receiving. So I think sometimes I would love for funders to look at it from not a numbers game, and not just the metrics, but looking at what is the depth of the relationships built within that community. And rather than saying, we'll scale this on a global level or on a regional level, why don't we also look at, can we scale what is working? Because we come into a community with an idea of this is and scale should look like. And what I've found with grantee partners, the Legal Empowerment Fund, we do have the metrics we want to meet. We do have the learning and assessment indicators that we would like to meet. But after we had an evaluation after our 4th year, and what we did find is that some of the indicators that had been identified that we were looking at for the MEL and for the learning and assessment was not, the communities didn't find those relevant. The communities did not, and it was actually, it was really, to me, it was fascinating that the thing that we kept on going for was not what community thought was important to them. So I think it would be great if donors and funders would look at scale impact as emanating from community rather than a metric coming from somebody like me living in Nairobi in a suburb, but really, again, being really intentional with how it is we are looking at it.
Thank you so much for taking it up so wonderfully, Atieno. Appreciate your insights. And now back to you again, Marcus, for another question from Lynette. What are some of the most practical tools or entry points for countries to begin integrating justice into public financing systems?
Thank you. What a great set of questions we have coming out of this event. I think one of the first steps for many countries is a simple mapping process. Because I think a lot of some of the best stuff that's happening is just not even on a justice minister's desk or awareness. So I mentioned the example of Citizens Advice in the UK that provides, basically paralegals providing advice on citizens' issues. And that isn't in the Ministry of Justice budget. It's actually on a budget that's shared across the Department of Business and Trade and the Department of Local Governments. So when you've got very key functions, not even on your own justice budget, you don't recognize that this is part of what you want to do. But I think, possibly in the UK with the case backlog problem they've got, I think they may start to recognize that one way of tackling the case backlog is reduce the flow of cases coming to the courts. And that's about pre-court interventions, and actually a well-funded Citizens Advice, stop some of these problems coming. And similarly, decently funded legal aid and assistance can also provide the same effect. So I think people are beginning to realize, we need to take this more seriously. We need to track where stuff has been done pro bono, just know, well, how much of it's going on. But people often have no idea what the level of support is. And this matters also when you think about equity considerations. So in my own country, in London, it's quite easy to find pro bono lawyers because quite a lot of lawyers live in London, and you can find the pro bono. If you go into more outlying towns, there are fewer lawyers, and this is particularly true in a country like Sierra Leone, where there's even fewer lawyers up country than there are in Freetown. You could then say, if you have a system that says, oh, the pro bonos will do it, you'll get a very unequal geographic distribution and also very unequal socio and economic distribution as well. So one starting point, just do some simple mapping and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for adding in your insights. We have one final question, another very important one, and I'd like to keep it open to everyone who is joining us as speakers today. How can community justice models deliver accountability, which seems an important outcome to communities and is a necessary deterrent, especially in the business and human rights justice sector? Any one of our speakers would like to take this question? Atieno, Leonie, Tom, Marcus, any one of you. And if you'd want, I can repeat the question again for you all. Go ahead, Marcus.
I mean, I think this touches on such a big issue, and I mean, if many people I know who work at Namati were on this call, they would be able to answer this question even more powerfully than I can do. But I do think the work, and again, it's interesting, the work's happening in Sierra Leone on this point, that you need some sort of community justice mechanism to hold foreign investors to account, for example, in a mining project. So foreign investors will come in, they say, yes, we'll generate jobs, yes, we'll ensure that everyone's paid the minimum wage, yes, to ensure that environmental degradation doesn't happen, which are wonderful, important promises. But how do you ensure there's accountability that those have actually happened? And it seems to me, unless you have community paralegals on the ground who are constantly picking up on what's happening, what the concerns are, and if you've got a good foreign investor who wants to do the right thing, they can also be blindsided. They may just generally not be aware of what's happening. But I think if you're saying, look, you need to invest in these kind of community justice models, because these will ensure that stuff is coming up. And sometimes it can just be unintended consequences. We know that, if you build roads, this can lead to such spreads of diseases unless you take countervailing measures. So it is easy to do harm without meaning to. And again, the community justice workers can pick all this kind of stuff up at a very early stage and can really help governments or investors that want to do the right thing to make sure they are actually getting information to do with it. So I think can be very important, and Namati's got, and there are others doing the same thing. Some really interesting pioneering examples in that space.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for taking this question up and for answering it so eloquently. I want to thank all of our audience members for sharing such. Oh, we have Leonie as well. Leonie, go ahead. We'd love to hear your insights.
Thank you. I think Marcus answered beautifully, but I also wanted to share that I think another way that community justice delivers accountability is that they bring justice right where the harm happens. So let's say maybe a factory underpays workers or a company pollutes maybe community land. Oftentimes people don't really know where to start, and a community-based paralegal can document this case. They can help the workers to write a complaint, or even connect them with labor inspectors or environmental authorities. So I will use an example in Rwanda because we often receive cases like this at the Legal Aid Forum, like labor disputes. So when a casual worker is denied pay, our paralegal can help them recover their wages by, say, mediating the conflict between the employer and the employee, or even referring the case to local labor offices. And I think that is immediate accountability because the workers, their justice needs are met, and businesses can also learn that exploitation won't go unchecked. So just wanted to briefly share that. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that perspective. We know that your work on the grassroots is so incredible. So thank you for chiming in and sharing that. And now I want to finally wrap this conversation up with a big thank you to all of our audience members for sharing such incredible and important and relevant questions today. And thank you to all of our speakers, Leonie, Atieno, Marcus, Tom, for sharing such incredible insights, and to everyone who joined this rich and engaging discussion. What we've heard today reinforces a simple but powerful message. Justice is not a side issue, it is central to the social development agenda. A few key takeaways that stand out for me from today's discussion is justice is essential to achieving the goals of the World Social Summit, from poverty eradication to decent work and social inclusion. After today's event, we're reminded that justice is not a standalone goal at all. It is an underlying one that speaks to every agenda we seek to advance. Access to justice and rule of law are the cornerstones of inclusive development, yet they often remain the least spoken about in the global dialogue. People-centered justice especially is practicable, fundable, and impactful, as we've seen from examples across sectors and communities today. And collaboration, innovation, and financing are key to scaling results because justice is everyone's business. As we leave this session, let's carry forward both the inspiration and urgency we've felt here today. The commitment to justice must not end in this room. It must inform how we plan, budget, and deliver development that leaves no one behind. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge the organizers and co-sponsors of today's event, the Government of Sierra Leone, the Justice Action Coalition, Pathfinders, the Legal Empowerment Fund, TAP Network, ACE-AJ, and the FIDA Uganda organization for helping sponsor and lead this event. On behalf of the organizers and all of those who join us today, I extend a deep appreciation to our speakers. You've been incredible, and thank you so much for taking out the time from all of your busy schedules to participate today. Before we close, I know there were a couple of different reports and statements and financing mechanisms that were shared throughout the duration of this event. So I'd like to share them in the chat, and also links to all of these resources that can help you stay connected with the work all of our incredible speakers are doing and what we're doing at Pathfinders. With that, I'd like to end this incredible event. Thank you once again for everyone who joined us today, and I hope you stay connected with us. And as I said, justice is everyone's business. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.